And one more thing before we dive into discussion, just for the audience, so that they know how do we operate this. First 30 minutes, we're going to listen to the responses from the panelists to the central question of today's discussion. And afterwards, we're going to open the discussion and audience will be able to ask their questions. But this is how we're going to do this. We ask the questions in the chat, and also we raise the hand if you want to come live and ask the questions yourself. However, if you don't want to be on the hot seat, then I will select questions and ask them for you, but it's completely dependent on you. Without further ado, let's start the discussion. I will first give the word to Professor Zuboff and ask her a question. Should we ban online targeted advertising on the premise that it violates human dignity? Professor Zuboff, floor is yours.
Thank you, Lexo, and thank you for inviting me to be part of this discussion with you and our friends at Leiden and others who are tuning in. I'm so happy to be participating. So I'm going to start with a story, and it's a story about the alchemist's great power to convert knowledge into power itself. Knowledge to power, the alchemist's dream. And in fact, in September 2020, the London Channel 4 news team broke a story on the Trump 2016 campaign's efforts to deter Black citizens from voting on election day. And this is one of those stories that the alchemist could only have dreamt of, which is why I'm going to share it with you now. So the investigative team examined more than 5,000 leaked data files with details on 200 million individual American voters, along with the analyses and models used to profile things like personality traits, political attitudes, behavioral dispositions, interests, concerns, vulnerabilities, and more, in order to target and manipulate voter behavior, especially focused on the key swing states of Michigan, Wisconsin, and Ohio. With only a modest budget to expand Trump's base, the campaign's digital director, a man named Brad Parscale, had gambled it all on Facebook, where corporate staff members embedded with the campaign helped him dominate what they called the tools. And you'll see me doing this every time I use that phrase. So Parscale used those tools to identify the citizens least likely to support Trump. And then they called this an audience and labeled that audience deterrence. This audience was composed of 54% of this group were people of color, including 3.5 million Black voters. A senior campaign official boasted to reporters at the time of the major voter suppression operations that the campaign had underway. Black citizens were bombarded with the standard range of algorithmic targeting mechanisms used in Facebook targeted advertising, subliminal cues, engineered social comparison dynamics, psychological micro-targeting, recommendation tools, real-time rewards and punishments, gamification, and more. Messages were engineered to produce negative views of Hillary Clinton, but also to persuade Black citizens that the most effective expression of Black protest was to withdraw from the election process entirely. The collection, computation, and manipulation of massive scale knowledge about these citizens produced massive scale behavioral change from citizens. Black voter turnout declined that year by 7 percentage points across the country, the largest decline on record for Black American voters. And Black voter turnout in swing states, where targeting was heaviest, was a full 1 point lower than Black voter turnout in non-battleground states. The episode suggests that citizens of the world's longest lived democracy relinquish their most solemn democratic right, the right to vote, without anyone ever holding a gun to their heads or showing up in the dead of night to threaten them with the gulag or the camp. Instead, these citizens ceded the right to self-govern in response to engineered digital communications, freighted with inflammatory messages and disinformation, specifically tailored to individual psychological and political profiles, until enough people chose to stay home on election day. This is not the totalitarian nightmare of Big Brother, who breaks bodies in order to bend souls to his single truth. This work here is accomplished by what I have called instrumentarian power, secretly wrung from knowledge, harnessed to the diminishment of human dignity through the friction-free conquest of human agency, autonomy, and self-determination, mediated by the big other of connected, pervasive architectures of digital instrumentation. Instrumentarianism annuls dignity without the threat of terror, violence, or murder. No blood, no bodies, no fingerprints, no enemy, no combat, seamless. In January 2020, as the world braced for another ugly election season that would test the resilience of American democracy, Facebook executive Andrew Bosworth posted a blunt memo crediting the corporation, Facebook, with Donald Trump's surprise 2016 electoral victory. Quote, "So was Facebook responsible for Donald Trump's getting elected? I think the answer is yes, but not for the reasons anyone thinks." Close quote. Mr. Bosworth laid Trump's success at the feet of Facebook's titanic machine operations, known to the world as online targeted advertising. Mr. Trump was elected, Bosworth said, quote, "because he ran the single best digital ad campaign ever seen from any advertiser, period." Bosworth lavishly praised Pascal, insisting that Trump 2016, quote, "remains the high watermark of digital ad campaigns," close quote. And he observed that this, quote, "unbelievable work," unquote, was the product of a simple discipline. Quote, "They just used the tools we had to show the right creative to each person." Pascal confirmed this conclusion with his inimitable style. Quote, "I always wonder why people in politics act like this stuff is so mystical. It's just the same shit we use in commercial, just has fancier names." Close quote. Bosworth's praise and Pascal's confirmation tell us everything we need to know. What qualifies as the, quote, "single best ad campaign ever" is mastery of the alchemy that underlies all of Facebook's machine operations, the transformation of knowledge into power. And the economic logic that drives this transformational capability is what I have called surveillance capitalism. Bosworth asserts, and Pascal agrees, that Mr. Trump's electoral success depended upon surveillance capitalism's bread and butter economic operations of data extraction, analysis, and algorithmic targeting. I have called these economics that shape these mechanisms surveillance capitalism because they combine core elements of traditional capitalism, private property, market exchange, growth, and profit, but these cannot be realized without the technologies and social relations of surveillance. Hidden methods of observation secretly consume private experience and translate it into behavioral data. They then operate outside of human awareness, robbing actors of the right to know, and with it, the right to combat. In an extraordinary development, these ill-gotten human-generated data are then immediately claimed as corporate property, available for manufacture and sales. The theory of surveillance capitalism challenges this property claim and redefines it as theft. In today's surveillance economy, personal information is the stolen treasure and surveillance is the getaway car. The entire economic edifice is built on this illegitimate bed of sand. These data join complex supply chains, travel to computational factories, are computed into behavioral predictions, and finally sold to business customers in a new kind of market that trades in predictive knowledge of human behavior. These are commodity markets in human futures, akin to markets in pork belly futures or wheat futures or oil. Surveillance capitalists sell the promise of certainty, a promise which requires data extraction and computation at an unprecedented and therefore unimaginable scale, both an expression and an extension of instrumentarian power. The first globally successful prediction product was the click-through rate, sold into the first stunningly lucrative human futures market, known as targeted advertising. These markets continue to provide the financial incentives for the massive scale extraction of human-generated data that is what I have called theft. Tragically, when corporate profits depend upon making human behavior more predictable, economic imperatives unleash a cascade of anti-democratic consequences that strike at both democracy's roots, human dignity, as well as democracy's superstructure, the concentration of power. On the strength of their knowledge and power, and for the sake of their surveillance profits, the private surveillance empires have mounted a fundamentally anti-democratic epistemic coup, a revolutionary takeover of what is known, of who can know it, and to what purpose. If we are to rescue the possibility of a digital and democratic 21st century, I therefore advocate a challenge to surveillance capitalism's operations of supply and demand, beginning with the codification of sovereign epistemic rights, a revocation of the license to steal human-generated data, and the outlaw of human futures markets, beginning with online targeted advertising, also known to many as surveillance advertising. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Zuboff, for your response. For the audience, I will just let them know that you will be with us for next around 15 minutes, 40 to 15 minutes. So after the discussion, they should use their time very smart to ask you some questions. Thank you very much again, and I will move on to the next panelist. Professor Frischmann, please, the floor is yours. Should we prohibit online targeted advertising because on the premise that it violates human dignity?
All right, so can you hear me? Yes. So, you know, I've done this a few times. Going after Shoshana is always very difficult because she's so good. Anyway, that was great. I have a similar big picture story, but I'm not going to tell it. So maybe in Q&A or later, I'll tell a similar related story. So Shoshana and I are like on similar pages and paths in terms of the diagnosis of our big problem. Although I'll say a bit about that. Let me focus on what you asked, the question that you posed. So thanks again. Let me start by just saying thanks for inviting me to participate. I think this is incredibly important, well-timed, well-organized event. And I think the question that you posed is a really important one. And like many important ethical and legal questions, the answer that's familiar to all of you law students is simple. It depends. I can't stop there though, right? You want more. All right, so if you really were to insist on an answer just to the question that you've asked, I probably would answer in the negative. Because targeted advertising, whether online or not, does not in and of itself violate human dignity. Depends on what kind of targeted advertising and how it's employed and used. But I don't intend to dwell on the arguments and the counter arguments in a typical legalistic back and forth. Rather, I would like to suggest that a reasonable answer to the question posed requires adoption of a much broader perspective. Put simply, to understand, evaluate, and address the techno-social dilemma that threatens humanity, we need to go beyond targeted ads, big tech, and even human dignity. So let me begin with that which is threatened. So the question posed focused on human dignity, and the definition that you provided to me, at least prior to the meeting, emphasized two assumptions. First, dignity of species explained in terms of the uniqueness of Homo sapiens, And second, dignity of the individual explained in terms of the equality of status among human beings. And then these concepts were then tied to autonomy. So human dignity as autonomy is a fundamental commitment, an infrastructural value for the human rights framework. And I agree that it is under threat. But I would caution against myopically focusing on it alone, for it is one among a family of such infrastructural values under threat. I agree with the first assumption regarding the dignity of the species grounded in the empirical fact that, as far as we know, what meaningfully distinguishes Homo sapiens from other species is our capabilities to imagine, conceptualize, and engineer ourselves and our environment. After all, human beings have special powers. We can imagine things that don't exist and communicate with each other in person at a distance and across time about these imagined things. It's these special powers that allow us to develop shared culture, beliefs, laws, technologies, and the other infrastructures essential to modern civilization. And so what matters most is how we exercise these powers across generations to shape our world and ourselves. This is how we engineer humanity. The second assumption regarding the dignity of the individual is a core component of humanity. It's a commitment to equality, a specific conception of justice. And over the past few centuries, we certainly have engineered the shared belief that despite many environmental contingencies outside of our control that shape who we are and what's possible, we all can be authors of our own lives. We can have some meaningful agency, degree of freedom, dignity, autonomy. But this freedom is not naturally given or inevitable. It is contingent on the techno-social world we build and sustain. And as such, it can be taken and it can be lost. So this shared intergenerational commitment to autonomy, human dignity, freedom to determine our own lives is threatened. But so are the very powers that make us special and empower us to meaningfully exercise our autonomy and agency and to participate in the making of ourselves and our techno-social worlds. Elsewhere, I relate these special powers to capabilities essential to human flourishing and examine how they are threatened by a host of techno-social engineering practices. One such practice, the alleged culprit in our discussion, is targeted advertising. And here again, I have a very simple point to make. Targeted ads matter, but they may be the tip of the iceberg. And we all know the danger of just skimming the surface. Think of targeted ads as both input and output. As inputs, targeted ads are stimuli engineered to generate specific responses, whether clicks, purchases, changes in beliefs, or even preferences. There are serious concerns about how these processes aim to generate automatic, unthinking responses or otherwise interfere with deliberative capacities. And these concerns are captured in the broader perspective I would offer. But it does not obviously present a violation of human dignity. Nor are targeted ads the only culprit here. Related techno-social tools for engineering humans include dark patterns, nudging, digital contracting, and other clicked consent mechanisms, among many others. On the other hand, targeted ads are an output of a complex surveillance and intelligence generating system that threatens human dignity and, more broadly, capabilities essential to human flourishing. The targeted ad output generates demand for all sorts of surveillance and intelligence generating infrastructures prioritized for the benefit of a few at the expense of many, as Shoshana has described quite well, centralizing and creating power. In other words, demand for ever-expanding surveillance infrastructure is derived demand. But is such demand exclusively or even primarily derived from targeted advertising? I'm not so sure. Certainly, if we focus on the commercial web, it seems to be a major driver, or if we focus on political advertising. But the digital networked world is much bigger than the web, and the surveillance infrastructure is much more pervasive. Consider, for example, the deployment of supposedly smart technologies in nearly every environment within which we live our lives, our public and private spaces, our homes, schools, hospitals, and so on. Examples involving government are legion. These examples are not really about advertising, targeted or otherwise, but they generate tremendous demand for always-on surveillance and control systems. The widely adopted and powerful logics of efficiency, optimization, and fetishized computational power generate the demand across a wide range of sectors. These logics create relentless pressure to eliminate friction, convert social interactions to transactions, and then to drive transaction costs to zero, to seamlessly interconnect techno-social systems so people can outsource all sorts of thinking and relating to supposedly smart tech. Again, target ads are a piece of the puzzle, but they're just that. You can't just focus on that one piece. So I've noted that we also need to go beyond big tech. So one way to get at this is if you recall the Cambridge Analytica story, right? That firm obtained information from millions of Facebook users and offered tools to identify the personalities of voters and influence their behavior. It's a pernicious form of targeted advertising. Now, there's a temptation to focus on Cambridge Analytica as this exceptional bad actor, but that's a mistake because there are thousands and thousands of similarly situated companies leveraging the platform to collect data and use it to develop actionable intelligence. So that might lead one to diagnose the problem as a Facebook problem, but that's a mistake because Facebook is just one of many big tech companies. And we could go on and on about this, but an exclusive focus on big tech is also a mistake. Why? Because there's thousands and thousands of smaller tech companies, all pursuing the same basic objectives, same logics, marching us down the same path. Digital network technologies are re-engineering our planet, our social systems, and our very selves. To examine the interconnected global and intergenerational considerations, and at the same time, relate those considerations to our everyday lives, I think the best, though admittedly imperfect metaphor is climate change. So here's one simplified way to understand climate change. We want energy. We need energy. It's essential to our modern activities. And we can build different supply systems for energy, but the one we've relied on for the past century is heavily dependent on burning fossil fuels. It need not be, but fossil fuels have been relatively cheap, convenient, and politically supported for past and current generations, leading to massive external cost pushed onto the future. Now, look, blame should be cast on fossil fuel companies, but we all bear responsibility too. We all make countless individually and incrementally cost-benefit justified decisions advantaged by cheap and convenient fossil fuel consumption. It's a massive global intergenerational tragedy of the commons. Now, dealing with climate change is politically and economically difficult because it requires significant structural changes, interventions at the macro, meso, and micro scales, and frankly, adjustments in how we live our lives. My claim to you is that the digital network environment suffers from a very similar tragedy. Every day, each of us, all of us on this call, everyone listening, and everyone else, right? We all make decisions about technology that on their own terms seem rational and unproblematic. We adopt technology and mindlessly bind ourselves to the terms and conditions offered. We follow scripts written and paths set by platform designers. We carry, wear, and attach devices to ourselves and our children, maintaining a connection, but increasing our dependence. We outsource thinking of all sorts because heck, there always seems to be an app for that. I mean, we could be talking about navigation, relationship management, knowledge production, all kinds of things. Each decision might be cost-benefit justified and even seen to be a clear exercise of our autonomy, perhaps even confirming our belief in the sanctity of human dignity. And yet, that might all very well be illusory, or at least rather thin, like the autonomy one exercises when performing the click-to-contract script. In the end, the net effect of these decisions on who we are and the lives we're capable of leading may be unjustifiable. Climate change may threaten our planet. Always-on techno-social engineering threatens our humanity. Targeted advertising is an important piece of this puzzle. Like a carbon tax, a tax or a ban on targeted advertising might be one important way, right, to address the social dilemma, but it must be one among many. It is hardly sufficient. This last point is basically a warning against panaceas. There are none. That's it.
Wow. Thank you so much. Yes, I was definitely after a panacea, but it was an immature dream. Let's go to Professor Floridi and hear the last panelist before we go to the questions. Last but not least, definitely, Professor Floridi, what do you think? Should we ban online targeted advertising on the premise that it violates human dignity?
Thank you. And also thank you for the invitation and for everybody being with us. I will give an answer, but not immediately. For the benefit of everybody online, I'm not going to show a PowerPoint. I've already confessed this, and I feel rather naked. So, and I don't have a script that I'm going to read either. It's going to be a lively presentation of a few ideas concerning that question. The point I'd like to start with is a bit of an anecdote, so you can see where I'm going to. Unfortunately, I've been told that we are recording this, so I will have to be rather vague, but I think that vagueness will not detract from the anecdote. A long, long time ago, in a city called Brussels, where some important people called European members of parliament tend to gather every now and then. I spent way too much time in that city to be inclined to remember. We're having the usual post-meeting canapé and drinks and so on, and there's a speech, and then we'll finally go to dinner. And I was a bit younger and less politically wise. So during the conversation with the usual powerful people that tend to attend those kind of gatherings, conversation leads to one topic, then another. And then I thought that it was very funny to suggest that perhaps the European Parliament could possibly pass a law banning advertisement, full stop. Not online, offline, just advertisement, as a huge waste of resources of any kind that sort of tends to absorb an enormous budget. Consider that those companies that you heard being mentioned already several times, they fight for the equivalent of the GDP of Sweden or so every year. Now, it's a fantastic amount of gazillions of dollars that are really attractive. If you want to make a difference, just make it illegal, full stop. I still remember, but you should have seen the faces around the table. The silence, the political embarrassment, and everybody all of a sudden had to find some way of tying their shoes under the table, because of course, I mean, it's illegal. It's a matter of freedom of speech to be able to advertise your products and so on. And so only a crazy philosopher from nowhere must be thinking that maybe we can ban the whole thing. I'm not so sure. I mean, we do ban many other aspects of freedom of speech here and there, but this is the anecdote behind something way more boring that is coming next. So you can tell how am I going to answer that question at the end of my little presentation, but not yet. First of all, we need to be clear about human dignity. And this is, I'm afraid, the analytic logic professor speaking. We don't have a clear sense, despite all the chat on the topic of what human dignity exactly means. And I'm not talking about a definition. Of course, we don't have a definition. These are rich concepts that do not allow for the necessary and sufficient conditions. As if you were talking about water. You define water, H2O, H2O is water, necessary and sufficient conditions. Forget about that game. But we don't even have a robust sense of what we mean uncontroversially. There are at least 4 different ways in which human dignity has been interpreted in the past. And that's because human dignity is connected to human exceptionalism. So if you ask someone, say, why do we protect privacy in Europe? Or because of human dignity. Okay, fine, but why do we want human dignity? Or because human exceptionalism. Okay, and what exactly is human exceptionalism? Or are you kicking the ball further and further away in the long grass? And then human exceptionalism comes in at least 4 flavors. I spare you the details, but happy to discuss this during the Q&A. One of the most recent of this is a Kantian, which you find actually in the text, a Kantian sense of autonomy. So we are exceptional because we are autonomous. We are able to give shape to our lives, meaningfully with plans, etc. You start thinking, well, that's good enough. What's wrong with that? A lot. Hugely wrong, because you would like to apply human dignity to future generations. And that kind of works because I think, well, I know they're not autonomous, but they can be autonomous. Okay, what about the past generations? All the people are not with us anymore. They deserve, our respect because of human dignity. And don't tell me that they can still be autonomous in any possible Kantian sense of the word, full stop, unless we try, really to turn and twist words in a way that, yes, anything can mean anything. And if you think that this is a bit too vague, here are two examples, one classic and the other one related to the digital technology we're dealing with today. The classic one is international regulation, self-regulation by museums. They use the terminology of human dignity and human rights to protect mummies. You don't make fun of mummies in museums. You don't, for example, dress them in a funny way during Halloween, because in a way, to be determined, we have a sense that it would be not respectful. That would have something to do with the human dignity of even someone who's no longer with us. Autonomy, I'm not quite sure it cuts that deeply. So yes, but not quite. Or, just to be more concrete, what happens to the data that we have once we die on Facebook? I did quite a lot of work with one of my students who's now a colleague in Sweden on the topic of post-mortem data management. These are digital remains. And you want to exercise some sort of sense of dignity in respecting those sort of profiles, even if people are no longer with us, etc. So back to us, back to the question, should online targeted advertising be banned on the premise that it violates human dignity? Human dignity equal autonomy? Not so sure. That doesn't quite work. So more needs to be done here in a moment. The other element here that is problematic, advertisement. What exactly counts as advertisement and doesn't count as advertisement? Any lawyer will be able to cut it very thinly and put you in one block rather than another. Look at the recent, days old, leaked just before legislation on AI that I'm sure you have had the curiosity to check. 80 pages, including the actual articles. And there's a lot there in terms of precisely making sure that the manipulation of individuals through targeted advertising by relying on some machine learning, AI, to put it generally, is not there. That Europe will build enough of a regulatory defense or framework to make sure that we are not going to be sort of instrumentally deployed by other tools and also humans behind those tools, so that we don't end up by infringing on the universal general principle of a Kantian nature, that you never ever use a human being only as a means, but always as an end. Kant was very careful. You can also use someone as a means, but not just as a means. In other words, you can talk to someone who is at the information office only as a means to get some information, but that's not the point. You treat that person as a human being, over and above treating that person as an interface between you and some information you want. So back to us. So what exactly are we talking about when we talk about human dignity? To be clarified, because autonomy doesn't quite do the job entirely. Advertisement, I like to introduce a tiny little model. I hope it will entertain you, and will stay with you for the rest of the day. What exactly is advertisement? So 4 steps, and it's going to be simple. I told you, no PowerPoint, so there's no safety net here. But point number 1, when do you have information? When you have a question and the answer. What's the capital of France? Paris. Alice is informed that, Paris is the capital of France. Okay, that's fine. Now, information, Q plus A. When do you have uncertainty? When you have only the question, but not the answer. So Alice wonders what's the capital of, say, Egypt, because maybe she doesn't quite know, Cairo and so on. What happens if you remove not just the answer, uncertainty, but also the question? Well, that's called ignorance. You don't even have the question, for goodness sake. That's really bad. Part of the education is to transform ignorance into uncertainty, but that's for another day. Not having questions into having questions. That's it. That's the game. No, of course you have a fourth step. When you remove the question, you have only the answer. That's advertisement. Someone tells you something you didn't ask for. This is the best car in the world. Couldn't care less. Didn't want to know. It's not for me. So bombarding, and you can tell this is an oversimplified little model, but bombarding people with answers they didn't have the questions for, or a supply that did not have a demand on the other side, that is advertisement. The reason why in the newspapers comes with a big no saying this is advertisement, because it tells you this is information you didn't ask for. Okay, thank you. Now, the trick here is that when it's targeted for a reason that goes over and above simply commercial reasons. So I want to sell you a car, a pair of shoes, or anything. Now, at that point, I'm targeting you in this particular context. No, it's not just any context, because as Brett said, this is a social political context. So I'm targeting you in order to change your behavior. And it's not just as a consumer. You buy that car rather than another. You buy my fridge, not someone else's fridge, but you vote for me rather than someone else. Now that starts getting a little bit close to human rights and the capacity that we should sort of cherish, if not exercise, of being autonomous, back to the human dignity. So we have human dignity, which is based on autonomy, but not quite, and advertising that when it becomes socio-political and targeted, tries to change people's behavior. I said change. It might actually change it for good. Nudging for good reasons. Mind that we complain a lot, and I'm one of the first. I'm totally in line. I'm just observing that when Obama introduced targeted advertisement at this level, he was the master of using media, digital media at his time, and won the elections. We were all very happy. I was the first to be happy. So in a way, when it's Trump and Trump-like people, and we have people like that in the UK too, Brexit included, or in Italy, the reason why we don't like this is because what kind of change they introduce. We should be more philosophical and just say, look, we don't like to have that level of influence on human beings, whether it's for good or bad reasons, whether it's nudging in the right or in the wrong direction. We should really be more gentle. And it introduces me, enables me to introduce the answer to the question through a certain interpretation of human dignity. I like to describe human dignity in terms of, and this will take much more than these 10 minutes, but maybe we can explore this a bit further, not in terms of autonomy only, but in terms of fragility, human malleable fragility. We're very special, not because we are strong, informed, rational, autonomous, but because we can be affected more deeply, more profoundly than anything else around us. Yes, you can beat a dog into not learning new tricks, but the kind of things that you can do to a human being is unbelievable. So back to us, if human dignity is a matter of fragility of future generations, of past generations, of the current generations, then the advertising that is targeted is a violence on the fragility of human nature. At that point, the answer to that question is absolutely yes. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Floridi. I think we have a great amount of things that we have to, or we can think about, and I myself have hundreds of questions to each one of you. But first, let's wait for the audience to ask their questions, and meanwhile, I would like to ask if the panelists want to add on to each other's speeches, maybe, because this might have caused some new insights. For example, for me, like I sent the definition of human dignity as having the autonomy as the source, because I went in a very legalistic way and definitely not through the ethical frameworks of trying to find frigidity. But of course, Professor Floridi, I was aware of your article in 2016 where you already suggest such anthropo-eccentric the sourcing of human dignity. However, my main question was if online targeted advertising is manipulation of human being, and if it's use of a human being as merely as means, then we have an issue, because human beings being ends is the core of democracy or human rights, and having the rule of law in the first place. So that's where the idea of the human dignity came in the first place, because that's how it's been used last 50 years in the legal domain. So indeed, but I think definitely, yes, we do need to work on the concept of conceptualizing human dignity for 21st century. See, Brett wants to add on.
Yeah, I mean, I'm happy, unless Shoshana, you can jump in front. I on the idea about human dignity, I took human dignity to be what you sent in the question, and worked from there. Though I agree with Luciano's push on the concept, recognizing it's more complicated, it's nuanced, there's a variety of different ways we can approach it. And I would say the same thing about autonomy, even the conception of autonomy. And so for me, and I know this resonates with some of what is in Shoshana's book, is to me, a lot of the threat is the threat to, among other human capabilities that are essential to human flourishing, one we spend some time on is free will, defined in a very specific way, which we were careful to do. And then, it's the ability to, upon reflection, the capability when upon reflection to determine for yourself those components of your will, which I would include beliefs, preferences, values, and intentions. And those are different things of our will. And advertising, targeted or otherwise, may or may not interfere with your ability to determine for yourself upon reflection when something is salient and you have reason to reflect. When it interferes with your ability to determine for yourself what you believe or how you intend to act, which is how I would think of autonomy. I tend to think of autonomy as your ability to determine your own intentions, a component of your will, to act. And then agency is your ability in the world externally to be able to act in pursuit of those intentions to satisfy other components of your will, like your preferences and your beliefs. But I think that the thing to think about is how digital advertising or other, and I would say other forms of techno-social engineering, other practices, whether it's nudging or other things, whether or not and to the degree they interfere with our ability to determine for ourselves those components of our will and then act upon them. Like, that's how I would broaden the concept of human dignity. And I wonder what Luciano and Shoshana think about that as a way to sort of open it up a little bit. But maybe, I'm not saying we have to go that direction, but that's one way we might.
Yes, thank you very much. I had a brief question to, brief question, I mean, I guess you wrote a book about it, but Professor Zuboff about the right to future tense and her way of conceptualizing the what's under threat. And I want to ask you, to speak about it and tell us how does exactly online, because online targeted advertising is also the framing that I use for this question. However, I do speak about the very specific problem of surveillance capitalism. It's just the tool that I had in mind, that was the technique that I had in mind that could be used as in my own framing. However, I want to ask, how does surveillance capitalism challenge the right to future tense? Because eventually I think the right to future tense is what is human dignity. Thank you.
Sorry, I forgot that I was muted. Did you want me to respond to that now, Alexa? I wasn't sure.
Yes, please.
Okay, on the right to the future tense. Well, yeah, and that connects to, quite a few balls that are in the air, including some questions I saw coming across the screen. I want to underscore something that Brett just said, and also that Lexo said that I think are important for my way of thinking about this, and it kind of influences how I think about Luciano's question about regarding humans from the past and humans from the future. So I think it's clear that the concept of human dignity, as Lexo presented it to us, and as we've largely been discussing it, this concept is located in history. We all understand that. This concept is a key element in the democratic imaginary, and which is to say, it's impossible to imagine a functioning democratic society without also imagining human beings who have what we think of as the more legal, lawful definition of human dignity, which has all of these components of autonomy, self-determination. I think autonomy also introduces the notion that that I find quite critical here, which is the ability to self-reference. In other words, the ability to have an inward thought process, if you will, what we can think of as that inner world to which we refer. And of course, this is central to the psychological theory of identity, which is also an historical concept that is nested with all of these issues. The point of identity is that we begin to develop an inner world, a notion of who am I, where we can reference values and perspectives and moral reasoning, that it doesn't simply come from what our parents told us or what our kinship system tells us, or the culture that we were brought into, what one is supposed to do, or what the others say, or what I'll have my hand chopped off if I don't do it, the compulsion and coercion. In other words, it comes from a self-construction. So all of these dimensions of dignity are deeply historicized, which I celebrate, because I think that democracy as a concept, of course, modern democracy, is something that advances the idea of self-governance, imperfectly, of course, so far, but that's something that is a work in progress, has been for quite a while. And that without humans who can behave this way, have these inward capabilities, there is no possibility of self-governance. So the right to the future tense speaks specifically now to this, what I regard as an unprecedented capability. Advertising is not a new thing. Nudging is not a new thing. Indeed, persuasion is not a new thing. Persuasion is as old as the human condition. What is a new thing is the ability of a company like Facebook, and this is just from a Facebook document, but this kind of, what I'm about to say applies in many different settings. Facebook describes its computational hub, its factory hub, what they call their AI backbone, is computing trillions of data points every day in order to produce 6 million predictions of human behavior each second. Now, those trillions of data points every day, only a fraction of those are what we knowingly provide to a company in return for this famous trade-off of its free service. The rest is what they take from us unilaterally, and what I am asserting is illegitimate, essentially theft. So here we have unprecedented machine systems based on wholly new technologies that have been rapidly advanced by first a small group of companies. That group has grown and their ecosystems have grown. Many small and middle-sized companies adhering around them. So now we have systems of invasive architectures that are able to dip into our lives, to lift behavioral data from our lives and to claim it as their private property and to use it for their own advantage, distinctly un-Kantian. But my thesis here is that this is unprecedented because it is, first of all, using a technology that has never existed before, at a scale that has never existed before, and therefore is able to do things with it that have never been able to be done before. And this includes now, coming back to the right to the future tense, fulfilling what was Professor Skinner's dream. Professor Skinner was, of course, the architect of behavioral engineering. And that whole view of the human being as simply a behaving organism. And these systems have now been able to perfect that view, bring it to scale, and realize it in action. And finally, that we're not simply talking about neutral systems, that somehow the digital got away from us and multiplied in the dark somehow. And this is what the digital does. This is how the internet behaves. This is what we hear over and over again from these companies. This is a specific economic logic that was allowed to root and flourish, again, at a specific historical moment due to specific historical conditions that had to do with the dominant economic paradigms involving neoliberal theory and so on and so forth. It had very much to do with 9/11, the so-called war on terror, and the demands that were unable to be met by public institutions, that were shifted to private capital to meet those demands for agglomerating human-generated data, and a variety of other very specific historical conditions that existed at a moment, a material moment, when this economic logic was allowed to move forward rapidly and unimpeded. So the bottom line here is that we're 2 decades into a digital century where the right to the future tense, which is a pre-political right, an elemental right, a natural right, not something that is actually codified as a juridical right, that we now have these global systems driven by specific economic logic that are able to impede our fulfillment of that autonomy, that agency, my ability to decide what I'm going to do. I'm going to go vote on election day, and to not have that intervened upon in a way that I am unaware of and therefore cannot contest, and end up engineering me into not voting at all for reasons that I am not conscious of. And in fact, if you follow what Channel 4 News did, one of the things that makes it so fascinating is in the end, they went door to door to households where the people live who were targeted this way. And there's this wonderful moment where they confront a woman. They've got the data sheets there. They've got the models that were made of her personality and her political orientations. They've got the analysis that was done for how to target her, what to do. And they were reciting all of this to her and actually showing her the pages. And she was staring in disbelief. And what she said was, what came out of her mouth was, "Who knows this? Who knows this about me? Who has this information?" And that, to me, it was a pregnant moment that says something about the nature of an information civilization. Power rests in these 3 questions about the distribution of knowledge, authority over that distribution, and the power that protects that authority. Who knows? Who decides who knows? Who decides who decides who knows? And in this case, all of these questions are being answered by private capital that has no standing under public law.
Can I just throw in there that all of those questions that Shoshana just raised are also being asked and answered with every deployment of any algorithmic system you can think about. So if you think about smart cars, autonomous systems, nothing to do with advertising. If you think about like smart car deployment and how we're designing smart cars, whatever the thing is, or smart homes for the home or whatever, it's not necessarily about advertising, but the exact same point. Who gets to decide? Who decides whether your smart home is sort of fully smart within your home or whether you send stuff out to the cloud, who gains what intelligence through the supposedly smart tech we build. Like all of those questions are asked and answered one way or the other. And unfortunately, like there's not a whole lot of political or community discussion about, you know, if you go to a given school about the ed tech they're adopting, or you go to a given city about how smart it wants to be, or you go to, you know, a variety of different contexts, some of which have to do with advertising, but many of which have nothing to do with advertising, but it all has to do with power, as highlighting, and these questions of who decides how, who gains what intelligence and what, for what purpose, and the often for the open-ended right to be able to determine future outcomes, whether through innovation or through other systems. They're being asked and answered in all kinds of different contexts. So for me, like I think everything that's being said is super important to pay attention to, and then generalize. Then like think about how it maps over to other related sets of contexts. The only other thing I would push on with Shoshana, just for fun, and not as a super critical thing, is just I think it's more than just the economic logic or behaviorism in and of itself. I would tie it to a bit of Taylorism, like scientific management of human beings using environmentally designed conditions, the workplace, the hospital, the home, and other places, right? So it's the deployment of environmental technology that reshapes and reconfigures environments in ways that train people within those environments to be more productive or more efficient, achieving sort of externally set objectives, right? And then you couple that with fetishized computation, which is not a new thing. So I guess one question is like, if we didn't have 9/11 or if we didn't have Google, would we still be in the state we're in? You know, probably. Maybe it would have been later. Maybe it would have been different in one direction. I see you shaking your head, so maybe this is a good like thing to go back and forth in. But like fetishized computation, the power of being able to compute and determine and scientifically manage people, you know, that's been growing over the whole course of the 20th century, right?
Not hidden. I just want to add a tiny footnote to what Brett said, which is what's important about online targeted advertising is not that it is the entire problematic today in 2021. What's important about online targeted advertising is that it was the first market that produced the financial incentives for massive scale extraction of human generated data, and that these markets continue to account for you. Some of you may have seen some of the first quarter earnings reports coming out yesterday. Facebook's earnings jumped 48%. Facebook is a company we're still, last time I looked, which is maybe a month or so ago, about 98% of its earnings still are accounted for by its ad markets. And for Google, that number is closer to about 88%. So when we talk about these giants, these markets are still the primary drivers of their ability to extract knowledge, which is then transformed into power. But of course, what has happened in the interim is that this economic logic has migrated not only to every app, not only to every product or service called smart and personalized, across the normal economy. So education, health, retail, real estate, finance, insurance. I mean, this has become the source of margins in virtually every commercial sector. So yes, cars, homes, bodies, cities, these are all the sites where this logic is being worked out at scale for all kinds of commercial opportunities that include but are not limited to targeted advertising.
Thank you very much. By now, we have a lot of questions from the audience. So I'll ask Mark Leiser, he's a professor at Leiden Law School, to come forward and bring forward his question to you. Mark, can you?
My mic's on. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah. My question's a very general one, which I've never actually been able to get a good, solid answer to. So I'm putting this question to the three panelists. Why should targeted advertising be banned when so many people actually like it, apply a privacy calculus to its use, and or rely on it. The latter speakers made reference to unwanted commercial solicitations, but in reality, targeted advertising is also responsive. So people, whether the panelists will be willing to admit it, find it helpful for opening sectors of the market that they did not about, products that they didn't know existed, and bring things and even ideas to users that they might not have been aware of. And isn't the banning of anything in a liberal democracy an infringement of my autonomy to receive targeted advertising if I chose to want to? Thank you.
I have an answer for that. And it's the last sentence you uttered. If I chose to, I cannot choose to, and therefore I'm not free to choose not to. It would be like living in a society where we argue that because people love and enjoy, and they think it's a great thing to have prostitution, therefore it would be a ban on the liberal attitude of people enjoying prostitution. Well, if there is no choice, then we start thinking in terms of maybe that's not a society we want to live in. I would love, and I would be the first one to say, where can I pay to have Facebook without advertisement? I'm on record, been saying this for a long time. Some of us are old enough to remember that, first of all, this conversation is old, like about 20, 25 years, but that's another story. But a long, long time ago, when we had only emails and stuff, and there was no Facebook, etc. Do you remember when we had a discussion in terms of making people pay for emails so that spam wouldn't ruin our lives? Now, even a fraction of a fraction of a fraction of a cent, you will not send millions of emails in one go because it would be too expensive. It would not be convenient. So there would be something. And I was on the side, and we're talking late 80s, early 90s, so a long, long time ago. I was on the side and said, yes, please, anytime. I'm happy to have charge, say, at the end of the day, $20 at the end of the year in order not to have to deal with. So I think that it is extremely dangerous to start thinking in terms of let's give people what they want, because that's not liberalism, that is insanity. I love whiskey, trust me. And if you give me more whiskey, I tend to drink more whiskey and chocolate and sausages. It would be insane to feed me with whiskey, chocolate, and sausages. Please take it away from me. So even if I love advertisement of the next pair of shoes, or should I really vote for Trump or someone else, I would like to be defended against my own wish. Beware of what you wish. Do not give people more what they want unless they have a choice. But as I said, it was the last sentence of your question that gave away the answer that perhaps might be more convincing.
But I've made the privacy calculus and agreed to pay with my personal data. So I have made that decision myself.
Did you have a choice not to?
I'm quite happy to. It doesn't matter whether I have a choice.
You are,
I can
but
choose.
I'm not. In a liberal society, I should have the choice not to. Or am I making a point too subtle?
But I can choose to use Netflix, or I can use to go to the cinema. I've made the decision to use Netflix and give up part of my personal data to do so.
Yes. So I think that there are some facts that is important to agree on. For example, people cannot choose really to have a search engine that doesn't come with advertisement. Not really, unless we want to be a bit too philosophical. Trust me, I know the game. Or they cannot choose not to be on Twitter because there's no Twitter without advertisement, or there is, etc. So these are monopolies that either you join or you are out of society. What choice do I have? Either it's like this or nothing. And this comes with advertisement. So I don't have a liberal society which tells me, yes, here I am. I can pay and I don't get, for example, Netflix without advertisement. I get, or whatever else is coming next. This is not the liberal society that you are describing. It's actually a society that runs on monopolies that force people to have certain kind of choices rather than others. I don't see why we couldn't be more liberal than you're just describing.
So what, can I jump in? So one argument is the one about competitive alternatives, right? And having choices.
One thing that I'm afraid that Professor Zuboff might leave us very soon. So would you mind if you first give her
not at all.
Sorry.
Well,
So
I just simply wanted to say that the idea that we're making an informed privacy calculation is an illusion, and it's an illusion that has been you know, construed and imposed upon us by these corporate actors. The fact of the matter is that the amount of data that we give them is only a small fraction of those trillions of data points that are being computed every day. Most of what they have about us is what they take without our knowledge, outside of our awareness, outside of any kind of privacy calculation. When they, some of you may have seen, for example, an exuberant press release from Amazon a few days ago that announced, hooray, Amazon facial recognition can now recognize fear. Well, if you get caught by Amazon facial recognition, it now can read fear in the micro expressions in your face, which are formed by all of those little muscles in your face. You have not agreed to give them your fear. They want your fear to align with confusion, disgust, anger, sadness, boredom, a whole bunch of other emotional readings that they can take from your micro expressions, because emotional readings are the best signals of future behavior. So emotions, sentiments are highly sought after data. When they see you walking down the street, they're less interested in your location than they are in the stoop of your shoulders and the pace of your gait, highly predictive signals. When they listen to your voice, it's all about the cadence of your voice and whether or not you're using words that you might not typically use. So CEOs who are now doing learnings, you know, they're on earnings calls, which are being monitored by machines. These machines are looking for these very subtle voice signals that turn out to be predictors of how that CEO actually is feeling, which is something that investors want to know about. So the bottom line here is what I call behavioral surplus. The vast majority of these data flows are behavioral surplus, what is taken from us, these metadata, the rich predictive signals, and the systems that take it are designed to keep us in ignorance, designed specifically, and the companies say this over and over again, designed so that we never know that it's happening. And therefore, the question of choice is a long way in, you know, off in another horizon, because there is no choice, there is no consent if you are robbed of the fundamental awareness of what's going on, unlike some of the things that happen in earlier settings, Brett, like Taylorism and things like that, where, you know, we could see and feel and experiencing it happening to us.
So I would just add that you got to look at the question that Mark raised in through a series of steps, and I won't go through all of them because it'll take too long. You know, but the first step is one that Luciano was, I think, going towards, which is like, you know, competitive alternatives, like the market's not competitive. If we had other alternatives and you had multiple choices, then people, you know, that's one set of response. Another set of responses is similar to what Shoshana was saying, is that look at the transaction that you supposedly have done the cost benefit analysis on and ask yourself, that trend, are there external effects that you're not accounting for, both with, you know, what you might think of as internal, like things that affect you that you're not able to sort of fully process when you do that cost benefit analysis. But then the reason that we're talking about this today is largely because of externalities where there are impacts more broadly on others besides you in terms of your practices and the decisions you make with regard to those transactions. You can go one step further and ask yourself, just like click I agree, click I agree, click I consent, and I have a whole chapter which goes through all this stuff. But if you go back and you actually think about, when did you actually go through that privacy calculus? When did you actually adopt a strategy for always clicking yes and then sometimes not or something? Or when did you decide which ones you're going to say no to? you'll find that most people most of the time can't recall or never really ever had that decision. They never actually went through that decision. Sometimes people do, but you're raising an important empirical question about how people interact with these sites and with digital ads and the trade-offs that they make. But so when we do the empirical work, we can kind of maybe answer your question a little bit more directly in terms of how many people actually engage in well-informed, rational decisions about the privacy trade-offs. Sometimes, certainly, some people might, but given the number of external effects and you know, maybe not. The other thing that Shoshana said that I think is really interesting is some of the markets might be complete, where there is a transaction that captures the costs and benefits, but there's plenty of incomplete and missing markets when we're talking about these situations. When there's incomplete and missing markets, there's a pretty strong case that there's market failures that we ought to be thinking about differently. So the idea that the market for privacy or the market for digital digital advertising set up this way is an effective one, I think is a hard one to fully accept. But even if you did, and even, by the way, Doc Searles has tons of work at the Berkman Center in his blog and elsewhere, where if you want to sort of go through a series of analysis looking at in links and whatever, like looking at how effective targeted advertising actually is and what the implications are and all that stuff, I recommend looking there as a decent starting place. Sorry, I went through some of the steps, not all of them, but some of them.
Thank you very much. There are questions about AI regulation in the chat, so I will read the first one. Maybe we can all reflect on that one by one. One question is about that AI regulation prohibiting certain AI technologies, but the way they have defined the prohibition seems that they have implicitly accepted that online targeted advertising is permitted, but with certain restrictions and compliance requirements. What do you think about it? And to what extent do you think these requirements can rein in the already pervasive digital practices? Professor Zuboff or Professor Floridi, will you start?
Please.
Okay, Professor Zuboff, then you go ahead. I'm not sure how are we doing on time, so that's why I'm asking you. But please, you go ahead first, and then we will go to the other.
Yes, I've got 5 more minutes, and then I have to disappear. I'm so sorry in advance that I have to do that. But I had a little trouble hearing the question, Lexo.
Question was about the artificial intelligence regulation by the European Commission and their framing of what's prohibited, and because it's not explicitly stated that online targeted advertising or it's not explicitly prohibited, the question was addressed to panelists. What is your opinion for the stance of the European Commission? Are they intending to ban this practice, or what's going on in the text?
So we're talking about this recent set of principles on artificial intelligence that the EC has just released.
The draft regulation that was
draft legislation. Yes.
1 week ago. Yes.
Yes. Well, look, this, as I think Luciano might have indicated earlier in the conversation, this is a complex document. There's a lot to study here. What I want to emphasize about this work is why I think we should celebrate it. And obviously, there's a lot to study. There's a lot to discuss. That's why it comes to us as a proposal. But I see it as a tremendous milestone in our era, in this century, because my chief concern, and I think I said this a little while ago, why are we in the third decade of the digital century with this pernicious, parasitic, surveillance-based digital capitalism that is eating everything up and really, causing so many of us to have the kind of conversations that we're having right now? And the answer is, at least there's one simple answer, and that is because democracy has not intervened to stop it. And what concerns me most in this space is the fact that, if we look at this from zooming out a little bit, we look to China, we understand that the Chinese Communist Party, the authoritarian state has been extremely intentional about the way that it envisions the digital century, about the way that it designs and deploys technology to survey. These are approaches that are central to domestic as well as foreign policy, and have been extremely powerful in advancing the Chinese form of authoritarian government. Now, when we look to the liberal democracies, we can't say the same thing. The liberal democracies have essentially failed to evolve a vision of a digital century that is a democratic century, to evolve a vision of digital technology in a way that advances democracy and democratic principles and aspirations. So in my view, this has left a void, and it's private capital, it's surveillance capitalism that has filled that void, leaving us with this, sort of, violent landscape that we've been exploring for the past hour and a half or so. So what the European Commission is doing, in my view, is beginning to, I think of the Titanic headed toward an iceberg, beginning to turn that vessel in a new direction, and beginning in earnest to authentically pose these questions. What would artificial intelligence, which is of course not a thing in itself, but a set of mechanisms and capabilities of intellectual capital and people and machines and software within these large economic organizations. And so they're asking, what would these capabilities look like if indeed they were designed and deployed to be aligned with and advance democracy, so that we have these digital capabilities now flourishing in democracy's house, flourishing under the rule of public law and the transparency of democratic governance. So this to me is a huge milestone. I celebrate it. Many of these principles, I think, show tremendous promise. There's a lot to fine tune in the small print, but that's what democracy is all about. That we have that conversation among ourselves as citizens, that the parliamentarians will be having those conversations and engaging with public comment. And it is we who have to be there in the parliament, in their offices, meeting with representatives, getting our views understood and known, so that the fine print is consistent with the democratic values that we want to see instantiated in this future. This, to me now, is the political work, the collective political work that is so critical now, and that these principles and this new legislative framework invites us to participate in, and I celebrate it. So with that, I do apologize for having to leave. I'm so happy to have been able to be with you, and I know you will continue a brilliant and fruitful conversation. So thank you so much. Thank you, Lexa.
Bye. Thanks, Shoshana.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you. So Professor Floridi, you will be next, right?
Thank you. Yes. I'm sorry that she had to leave, Shoshana. I was going to say that we need to be a little bit more specific. The text, once you read it, unfortunately, it's, as the question says, a bit vague. The vagueness of the text might have 2 or 3 consequences. One, it stays vague and it causes some damage, because the vagueness is interpreted by different countries, for example. We're talking about 24 months, say, or take it or leave it, of conversations in Europe, stays vague. Countries interpret it in different ways. You start having a bit of a sort of a puzzle of different legislations in Europe, some banning or not banning, or blocking or not blocking. So that's a bit not exactly what we would like to see, a more unified European perspective. The text goes specific, and it goes specific in the wrong direction, which again is a problem. It's vague for a reason, because it's very, very difficult to be much more specific about what kind of, say, advertisement-based sort of AI-run influence should be forbidden. Remember that the text is all about high risk, AI that is highly risky. In two senses that unfortunately are ambiguous in the text. So one way that I would like to see that sort of specified and clarified is to say, well, in one context that is risky. And for example, the context we're discussing today is the socio-political context. And I think that it is risky there. I don't like to see sort of AI being deployed to manipulate sort of public opinion or foreign public opinion in the massive way in which may be possible, without Europe saying, well, no, you should not do this, and you better reconsider. For two reasons, I mean, and I stop here. One is the opacity, and the other one is the accountability of the process. Again, maybe I'm too much of a philosopher. I like to be specific. I mean, vague narratives about, no, 21st century, I find them a little bit too vague for my taste. Especially when you have only one hammer and one nail. But if we instead use all the tools in our conceptual sort of bag, then we might start considering that some kind of advertising is perfectly fine. And as some of the questions are saying, yeah, I would like to know that since I am looking for a car, I might actually enjoy being told that there are new electric cars coming up. So let's be a little bit more sort of realistic and calm down with overtones and look at the specific. In this case, why socio-political influence being a problem? And I stop here. Well, because I said, there's opacity here. We don't know quite, right, who is doing what. This happened with Brexit. We didn't quite know who was paying for what advertisement, influencing which kind of population. Not exactly the motive we want to have. So transparency. You're going to pay for it? Well, you're going to tell, no, Trump has paid for this advertisement. Well, at least, we have a sense, or Boris Johnson, for what I know. And then accountability, because that comes with transparency. Once you know who is paying for what, you also can tell a little bit more, okay, so if something goes wrong, if someone starts saying, the best thing that we possibly have here is to do A, B, and C, and then A, B, and C go bananas, well, then you can go back and say, well, this was paid by you, you are responsible for that. But without opacity, without sort of transparency and accountability, I'm not quite sure that we want to go down this road. But the question is completely right. There's too much vagueness at the point. However, it's, if you like, draft number one. So we can do some work to make it a better draft.
Thank you very much. Professor Frischmann, would you like to comment?
All I'll say, because they've pretty much covered the territory. I'll say that when I read the regs, the draft regulations, I'll just tell you the one that jumped out at me. Not necessarily, it could be read to apply to some forms of targeted advertising, but it could be read to a lot more. So for me, it's Article 5, 1A. Okay, and I'll just read, I have it here, so I'll read it real quick, right? The following AI practices shall be prohibited: the placing on the market, putting into service, or use of an AI system that deploys subliminal techniques beyond a person's consciousness in order to materially distort a person's behavior in a manner that causes or is likely to cause that person or another person physical or psychological harm. Now that, to me, is big. I don't know exactly how all those terms of art are going to be interpreted and applied. In fact, I've been asking people, and by the way, this is, you all know, this is rather new. It just came out, and I've been doing 1,000 other things besides reading these. But I took a glance, and as I read through them, that's the thing that just jumped off the page as being potentially, and that this is a prohibition, right? It's a flat prohibition. And so that's the one that really jumped off. Why did it jump off? I mean, I don't know if you guys are interested, but why? I mean, could it apply to targeted advertising? Some, right? Some forms of targeted advertising that basically are targeted, and then the means by which they are in asserting influence are taking advantage of, you know, behavioral biases, or sort of like, you could think of like bad nudging, right? Basically nudging, you know, techniques to take care of sort of behavioral tendencies that lead people to distort, you know, materially distort a person's behavior. And that behavior, again, can be interpreted in a variety of ways, like the kinds of behavior we might care about. You know, I think it's hard to say like what exactly does the kind of psychological or physical harm that would count. But anyway, that's one that jumped out at me as being, I don't know if what Luciano, what you think about that, if that like that prohibition jumped out, or if you think it even plausibly applies to some forms of targeted advertising.
No, I think that is exactly some of the risks that are implicit in the paper, in the draft. That didn't strike me more than others, not because it didn't, but like many other sort of pieces there, which, you know, to have a charitable reading of well, besides, I mean, in a sort of very indirect way, I'm responsible for a little bit of that document because through the high-level group. So I think it picks up a few ideal regulatory views. Say it would be wonderful if this were possible, and it runs with that. Now, okay. So and I would love to take, for example, the other thing that jumped out. Have you checked what it says about what kind of data AI can be trained on? Well, machine learning models should be trained on data that are 2. I mean, there is no single database in the world that has those characteristics. Updated, truthful, reliable, without bias, curated. Like, yeah, anytime. I'd love to have that kind of stuff. But where do you find it? Because there is not one hospital that has that database about its patients. Maybe not updated. Maybe there's a bit of no. There was someone was female, male, you name it. Or think about a library. I mean, how many the kind of a library is that truthful, reliable, without bias? So the trouble that I find in that document, but then we go back to the Lexo main argument, is it's kind of too aspirational. So it's more almost like saying it would be wonderful if we could have this. Yes, but I think in the next couple of years, what we're going to do is to kind of lower down the expectations and become way more pragmatic and say, okay, unfortunately, in this world, this is not possible. This is not, if only, but, and then calm down in terms of tones, which then become compatible with true innovation. Because some of the questions, which I agree on the panel here, of course, advertisement is also part of the innovative, entrepreneurial way in which we deal with the world. So it is a form of communication. And one of the things I said during my initial statement is that it's freedom of speech. So there is a reason why we cannot ban it. Remember that funny dinner? It was a joke, because you can't simply go around and say, from now on, you cannot advertise, say, your shop around the corner. It's not something that we're going to see, not in those terms. But there are ways in which you can sort of make it more acceptable and socially fruitful. Yes, that is what we talk about here.
Right. So for the law students in the audience, which there are plenty, like it's a representative form of legislation. So the aspirational goals that you're then going to trim back when you go to implement, regulatory agencies go to implement an aspirational law set down by a legislature, for example. Like it's a certain form, like we can see it. And then there's the other from the opposite spectrum, you often have sort of incrementalism, whether in the US we think of it sort of like a common law approach. Anyway, so for the law students out there, you can kind of see this as sort of a case study in sort of different forms of making law and implementing. Anyway, I'm rambling.
There is one specific question in the chat that I wanted to raise to you before we also give the floor to other people who raise their hands, and maybe that will be nice to hear other people speak. But before I'll ask this question, I would like to know your opinion about the term predictability, because I think it has a strong bond with the concept of human dignity. The predictability that online advertising and digital in general is promoting simplify people into clusters or niches. This is a strong risk for the human growth. If we find we're simply what we expect, what about the possibility to change the idea, to know the differences that exist in life, to confront each other. So the question is about predictability and the human dignity.
Yeah, so I'm happy to just make a quick statement on this. I agree with the sentiment of the commentator and the person who wrote the question. And I don't know this is necessarily a digital advertising thing in particular. This is just another example of where I think the broader set of concerns about becoming increasingly predictable. So I've written a bunch of stuff. This is in Reengineering Humanity. There's a Guardian article about this, but the risk of us becoming increasingly predictable and thus programmable people. We become more machine-like in our lives, the more predictable and programmable we are. And that's partly a function of the data-driven design of the infrastructures and environments within which we live through the deployment of supposedly smart technology. Right? The more we outsource to predictive tools that are making predictions about what we want, how we're going to behave, the less room we have for being unpredictable. Right. And so one interesting example, perhaps, is I'll give you Pedro Domingos, who's a sort of a famous AI leading expert in AI, wrote this thing in Scientific American. I think it was like 2018, 2019, where he was sort of celebrating this idea of digital doubles, where we'll soon be able to have run this technology where there'll be a digital double of you that will then be able to go on a simulation of millions of different dates. Right? Dating, it'll do all the dates, and it'll also live countless millions of different lives. And then based on that, it'll be able to make predictions about the life you ought to live and the partner you ought to have. So no more bad dates, no more mediocre dates. How many of you out there, all you students are like, woohoo, yeah, great, no mediocre bad dates. So I wrote a response to Scientific American the next month or something. I was like, this is terrible. Your utopia is my dystopia, man, because bad dates and mediocre dates are how will you know what you like? How will you learn what your preferences are, right? Humans are costly and unpredictable, and that's part of what makes us special. You might need to go on some bad dates and mediocre dates, and we can substitute dates for any kind of experience, frankly, to figure out, so you can sort of figure out what it is you want, what kind of person you are, and who's the best person for you to be with. That may take a bunch of experiences. How will you know what you like and who you are going to be if you haven't had any of your own genuine and authentic experiences yourselves? So the whole idea, life and dating and so much else, are not just computation problems. They're not just prediction problems. And so that, to me, is the biggest. This is, I think this was resonating with the comment, which is just, the idea, just succumbing to the convenience of prediction is dangerous. The other comment that I saw from my friend James Facile in the comments was yeah, but a lot of these predictive machines are terrible. Are they actually even good at making predictions? And I responded to him in the comments, I don't know if people saw it, which is does that make you comfortable or more worried? Right? Are you happy that things are the prediction machines aren't that good, and so in their error you can live in the space of their errors? Or is the fact that you're being led down a path defined by the errors of a prediction machine that's wrong about you? Is that? And I think it could go both ways. You could say, again, the lawyer answer I answered in the very beginning, open my talk with, it depends, right? There's not a simple it's good or it's bad. Anyway.
Maybe I can add a footnote or two. So predictability, the machines are clearly very bad at predicting, but most of the times, we need to remember that they're not there to predict, but they're there to influence, which is a different story. It's not that I know in advance what you want. I want to make sure that given the space of flexibility that you have, you choose A rather than B. So it's not that for example, I may know that Luciano likes Italian food. It's Italian food, but I don't know that he hates Parmigiana and he loves pizza. But because he loves Italian food, which is sufficiently, clear, then I nudge him towards this rather than that. So we need to understand, otherwise this becomes really science fiction, and this whole conversation today, between the political, whatever, and now the technology that also going bananas. I mean, we lose sight of the real problems. So the real problem is not that these people, whoever they are out there, they know me, they know what I want. No, they don't. But they like to know that they might actually influence you to go right rather than left, or left rather than right. And it's the malleability of the individual. I mean, how many times have you walked into a restaurant and asked for what's good today? Wasn't that asking to be influenced by someone? So the malleability of the individual, which is crucial, is important, is part of the not of the predictability, but of the influenceability of the individual. Then there's something else. And on this, maybe, I don't know if, I'd like to know more from Brett whether we agree or disagree. But it is true that, I mean, it's true since the analysis provided by Descartes onwards, that the more rational you are, the more you are predictable. It doesn't take a genius, does it? No? No. So if you rationally choose always the same toothpaste because of taste, price, affordability, well, trust me, I don't have a shopping list. And when I come back home, I have always the same products because I run through the same kind of reasoning. Oh, I like this. Da, da, da. So the more rational you are, the more predictable you become. So in a way, and that's to make the conversation a bit lighter, if you want to be unpredictable, just go crazy. Just ask for something that you never ever like. Stop inputting there things that you hate. Then the algorithm will go bananas. You say, oh, I thought he loved pizza, but now he says, no, he loves Indian restaurants. So more seriously, part of the predictability that we have is the major basic line that if you are in your 50s and you are white, male, etc., you probably not like that kind of holiday rather than another. That's the level. But anything else, now I think we should really stop running fetishism about this.
Let me react a little, because I think we sort of agree, and I think there's a point at which maybe we don't, right? Okay. So two things. First of all, I'm very predictable. Ask my wife, ask my kids. They'll tell me I'm way more predictable than I would care to admit. They can make predictions about me, they're very accurate, right? But I'm not programmable always. I'm even programmable, I should say, right? I can be influenced strongly. They know how to get me. They know what buttons to push, right? But it's about I'm not always predictable. I'm not always programmable, right? And so I think one of the concerns is, and this is the concern in my book and a lot of my work, it's not that we are in a state right now where we are fully predictable and programmable. It's that we are on a path I'm mostly concerned with the world we're building, the deployment of technologies that will only get better. Okay, the prediction machines are inaccurate. You don't think their accuracies will improve? Okay, Facebook's emotional contagion experiment. They're testing an emotional contagion to see whether it exists. You don't think that it wasn't terribly effective. You don't think it'll get better? I think it's a mistake to say Cambridge Analytica was really bad at influencing people based on psychometric profiles. Don't worry about it. Who cares? The point is what they're testing will only get better. You're concerned with the ever improving, increasingly capable, better at predicting and influencing version of Cambridge Analytica, not the imperfect, didn't work very well version of Cambridge Analytica. So for me, I'm more concerned about
common sense. Yes.
Yeah. So that path we're on, where we're going, looking towards the future is sort of where it may seem like sci-fi, but you know what? Lots of old sci-fi looks incredibly predictable. Yeah. But then I agree with you that if you look at current present day people who are, I want to predict whether I can sort of nudge you left or nudge you right or sell you this or sell you that. Yeah, no, I agree with you. That's kind of the state of the world we're in.
Yeah, no, don't worry. And I agree with you. And it's common sense. I mean, they get better. I mean, there are two limits here that, again, for realism, so that we talk about the real world, some kind of science fiction. One, it's never about the individual. It's always about the mass. The argument on the other side couldn't care less about Luciano. He wants the type. He wants 100,000 customers. Whether it's 100,000 including me or not including me, couldn't care less. So a long time ago, again, at Brussels, I explained this by saying that the arguments on the other side, we're not Moby Dicks. We are sardines. Couldn't care less about your sardine. You sardine. Oh, I'm so important. He's talking to me. No, he's not talking to you. He's talking to a mass of people. And once you have enough votes, couldn't care less whether your vote is in it or is not in it. So mass, numbers, large issues. That is depressing because we all think that we are very important and at the center of the universe, but of course we're not. And we're not Moby Dicks, we are just sardines, and it's the shoal that counts. And to save the sardine, you had to save the whole shoal, but that's for another story.
I want to be a tuna. I don't want to be a sardine.
Well, welcome to reality. Let me just finish. So the other point is the economic feasibility, Brett. I mean, not only we are sardines, but they don't care below a certain threshold. It's just not that interesting. So yes, maybe the technology will develop, maybe not. But will there be an interest in going, spending, say, $1 million to make sure that I can predict whether Luciano likes this toothpaste rather than that toothpaste? I wish I were that valuable, honestly, but it won't be that way. But they will spend $1 million to make sure that they have 100,000 people buying more that toothpaste rather than another. Whether Luciano is in it or not, it does not matter. Unless we get to this level of realism, anything else is enjoyable academic chat.
Yeah, we can go to the next question. I agree. Like, I didn't mean to interrupt you. I was actually just making a joke about I want to be a tuna, not the sardine. Didn't mean to interrupt your flow.
I think it would be nice to give floor to one of the persons in the audience. Bursa wants to ask a question. Bursa, please come forward.
Thank you, Lexo. Thank you all to the panelists today for inspiring, for all the information you have shared today, because I'm a Master of Science Law and Society student at Leiden Law School. And thanks, Lexo, for organizing this panel. It was very informative and still is. I want to ask this question to all the panelists today. So how can digital rights the best way mobilize against digital surveillance? Because I'm studying law and society, so basically I want to understand how the citizens perceive surveillance. Like you already touched on Cambridge Analytica scandal, and there's this movie on Netflix available, The Social Dilemma. They provide actually like quite an insight that I didn't personally as a scholar. Now I'm investigating how surveillance like studies are, how the US is actually doing this, and how the rights can be actually mobilized in the European sense. After the scandal happened, like the EU took action, but it was not immediate. It was like the EU GDPR and this European data protection supervisory, it's working on things. And as Professor Zuboff already touched on it, that we as well-informed individuals, we need to write to the local policymakers or the national policymakers or companies. But I want to hear your insights on this. And so what are the possible solutions, and what do you think of this? Because we talked today about a lot of things, including nudging, and nudging is not only conducted by corporates like Facebook or Google, it's also conducted by governments. Like they work together. And, in the US after NSA, actually Snowden's revelations, a lot of like global attention was received. So I'm really curious to hear your thoughts about this, and how can citizens in the legal sense and also digital rights sense legal framework use their rights against the corporates, the companies, I want to just like hear what you think about this. And if you're aware, I'm sure you're aware also about the Australian government case on Facebook. Like there are a lot of like law cases and bills going on and debates ongoing, but just hopefully my questions were clear. And thank you for your answers already in advance.
Thank you, Bursa. Who would like to go first? Would you? Okay, Brett, please.
I'm happy to, and let Luciano, you can go first if you want. That made a difference to me. Great question. Thank you for that. The way I approach solutions. So remember, I made the climate change when I opened up. I made a climate change argument, right? Like as an analogy, and I kind of look at humanity's techno-social dilemma, the kinds of things we're talking about today, in similar terms. And what that means is like you can't solve climate change with just a carbon tax, though a carbon tax might be a useful means for addressing the problem, part of a solution set. And the same thing is, so you need to do other things. We need to, food production, and I'm not going to go through the whole climate change thing, but there's a whole bunch of things at the micro, meso, and macro levels that we need to be able to do collectively to deal with climate change and individually. Same thing is true with humanity's techno-social dilemma. So what to do with regard to surveillance? There are things to do at the micro, the meso, the macro levels, right? Some of them have to do with like broad things like the GDPR, like nationwide, sort of legal reforms with regard to surveillance, or with regard to, we talk about some contract law reforms, right? That one could think about, a whole bunch of things. But then you can go down and think about fighting the logic, right? So looking for alternatives out there to the platforms that are the most convenient and widespread, that enjoy the largest network effect. So you might look at decentralized, peer-to-peer based options, for example, for some of the services that you like. Like if you're thinking about, I use Proton Mail instead of, you can like think about, like, I'm going to start supporting and endorsing and using alternative sets of services that actually reflect the values that I have, and not just are useful for convenient purposes, right? And so part of it is acting as a consumer of tech and user of technology more deliberately and carefully and consciously about what you're doing. I think it's, at the end of my big book talk, when I give book talks, I always throw the Rage Against the Machine album cover from the song Wake Up, because I'm a Rage Against the Machine fan, but also because one of their songs, Wake Up, is like, part of it is just waking up and helping other folks around you to wake up to the world that you are in, and being a more active and engaged person. I think at like local levels, like there's some interesting examples of places like, so I'm studying smart cities, and there's some interesting, like in Seattle, they have a surveillance ordinance that is a very carefully drafted local policy for what the government or any government department has to do when it decides to procure or deploy surveillance technology, sensors and data collection. Boom, you've got to actually go through a very particular process. Doesn't mean they ban it, doesn't mean there isn't surveillance, doesn't mean you can't have certain technologies, but it orients the public and involves the public in engaging with those kinds of decisions. I think in schools, I look at certain places, certain sites and places where the unthinking, unwitting sort of adoption of technology is being pushed by hype or vendors, or worries about, oh, we got to stop, we got to be able to stop the next school shooting, so let's just put facial recognition technology to identify, even though the facial recognition technology will do little to nothing to actually deal with the actual problem, right? But so it's like engaging in those school districts, in those debates, and sort of raising awareness and actually standing up to the hype and the pressure to sort of adopt supposedly smart tech whenever possible. I mean, there's a whole bunch of things. So I've rattled off really quickly, but what I want you to see is that there are individual things, there are community level group things, there are things to advocate for at the national level. Some of them have to do with law, but some of them have to do with technology and the technologies you choose to use. I hope that was helpful.
Thank you, Brett. I also want to add one.
Sorry, Bruce.
Yeah, okay.
For the sake of time, we can't.
Sure.
Could I just add something to that question?
Yes.
Just very quickly. So normally you have four ways of dealing with the problem you highlighted. So how do we cope with this particular problem? Either you put some leverage on the market, or you put some leverage on public opinion, education, etc., or it's all and not exclusive, or you use legislation, or you use self-regulation by the sector. These 4 points of pressure in the issue that you are highlighting, discussing today, one is gone. Self-regulation is a season that we had an opportunity, there was a window, it's not working anymore. The market doesn't seem to be working in that direction. So maybe we will be able to reform the market and provide the incentives to change direction. But at the moment, unless you start working on the advertisement model of this industry, for example, or in the case of the state, it's not even a market, I'm not quite sure we have the strength there, but there might be a chance. Education, public opinion, as we heard from Brett here, that is a part of the solution, although it's also part of the problem, as we heard before. Now, we get what we want, and we like it. So it's a bit of a problem there. As you can tell, I'm leaving legislation as a very European way of dealing with this. And honestly, footnote, and I'm sorry that Shoshana is not here, because we should start thinking that the rest of the world is not America, for goodness sake. And I'm sorry that they have a really difficult time in their own country, but welcome to Europe. We know how to do things differently. And next time anyone asks you why you're doing what you're doing with the European legislation, the GDPR, the stuff about AI, because that's how we do things in Europe. And if that reminds you of anything, that's Athens, 5th century before Christ. And this is how we do things in Athens. So that is the European way of doing it, and therefore puts government and big business one against each other to make sure that civil society gets all the benefits from that particular fruitful competition. So the state keeps an eye on business, business keeps growing while meanwhile keeping government a little bit more honest and more efficient, and civil society grows decently. I think that is a way forward that we can welcome. But don't forget, sometimes we are in need of being reminded that there is a European way of doing things very well. We do it better here.
I'm going to throw in a tiny thing. I know, Lexo, you want to get to the next one. Let me just say, it's partly responsive to one of the questions in the chat and to what Luciano just said. It's not just government or market. Right. So a big part of what, and you mentioned civil society, Luciano, so I think this is what you're thinking, but like there's also community-based, commons-based governance and solutions. There's peer-to-peer based solutions, decentralized forms of governance and technology to enable us to do what we want to do together. So I think, sometimes, especially like EU versus US, you get caught up at like the market will solve it, we'll rely on the market and don't mess with the market, versus like, no, the government can do it, we don't really, it's more complicated, but there are also a whole bunch of other community-based social institutions that we can rely on, right? Because that we can put more trust and put more work into to solve some of these problems. That's all I just want to throw in.
Thank you very much. I have a question, because there are two questions, two people who want to ask a question. Maybe we will limit ourselves with 5 minutes and
okay.
The both questions one after each other, and we can respond to them. Matteo, please, you go ahead first, and then Andreas. Matteo?
Hi, I am a graduate student at the Oxford Internet Institute, so I know Professor Floridi, obviously. My question is a bit more technical and related to the bigger picture we have traced here. So particularly with reference to Professor Zuboff's work, it seems that in the bigger picture, we don't actually have a solution to contrast these mechanisms that are behind targeted advertising and dangerous social influence. But in fact, is there a possibility to bridge the gap between the actual unknown algorithmic structure of these technologies, and in particular recommender systems that are behind the functioning of this online social influence, and the research that is being done and is being done on about AI explainability or AI for social good? Because here I think that there is a point missing, that is a link between these two clusters of research, and I think that scientific research and academia could help bridge this gap in collaboration with supranational institutions. And here I am thinking in particular about the work on explanations in recommender systems that has been developed for about 2 decades, starting with the work on medical experts, on expert systems in particular. So my question is there a way to bridge this gap with scientific knowledge and collaboration between academia and government?
Thank you very much, Matteo. Let's first hear Andreas as well for his question, and then we respond to both questions. Andreas.
Yes, hello, my name is Andreas Huisman, and I'm an external PhD candidate at eLaw. And I have a question for Professor Floridi. When interpreting human dignity as fragility, would targeted advertisement based on detected emotions, for example, derived from effective computing or emotional AI, be a type of targeted advertisement that in fact should be banned? considering that an individual might be more vulnerable or fragile, and thus susceptible in a specific emotional state?
I didn't hear the whole part, so
I will repeat the question because it's also in the chat. When interpreting human dignity as fragility, would targeted advertising based on detected emotions, so derived from effective computing or emotional AI, be a type of targeted advertisement that in fact should be banned, considering that an individual might be more vulnerable or fragile and thus susceptible in a specific emotional state? This is a question. So whether emotional AI used in targeted advertising should definitely be banned. Yes, who would like to comment first? Brett, do you already have a response?
Well, no, I was gonna say it's Luciano. Both questions were directed at Luciano, so I think I'm happy to wait.
Yes.
Okay, so briefly, I think the second question is a statement with a question mark. It's a rhetorical question, isn't it? Whether I agree with the statement, that's just for the students among us. Questions are things where you ask someone's opinion, as opposed to, well, whether you present a rhetorical question and do you agree with this or not. So I tend to agree. I think that some of the things that we said before, that Brett also stressed, we need to be careful not to transform this technology into, again, science fiction. The emotional capture of whatever the feelings of an individual, etc. Yeah, to some extent, etc., etc. But remember, I mean, this technology is rough and ready, blah, blah, blah. The whole point is to get the maximum number of people. It's not to interpret you. It's not about you. It is true, however, that the more people are fragile and at risk, the more careful we should be, to a point where this technology should be simply banned. I mean, it's like children or people with real difficulties, cognitive, etc. So I think that there is a sense in which we can take more as adults, and a bit like smoking. Now, we don't forbid smoking, but we do try to make sure that people underage don't smoke in this country, because it's particularly damaging for them. A grown-up, well, if you want to use your lungs in a different way than they're normally meant to be, well, that's your business, so to speak. But there's taxation, back to what Brent was saying, a number of ways in which we try to nudge people. The previous question was, I think, again, a bit of a rhetorical question. Yes, of course. I mean, more interaction between academia and market is very, very welcome, especially when it comes to the level of interaction between sort of research. So I welcome, as Matteo Papi was mentioning, in the context of recommended system, that's a good idea. We're doing it. We could do more. I don't think it's going to be the solution, though. Back to you, Brett.
Yeah, so on the Matteo's question, I'll say, yeah, I agree. It's a rhetorical question. I think the answer is yes. Yes, more research and collaboration between the communities you've identified would be a good thing. Whether it will lead to a desirable outcome, who knows? It's hard to predict the direction that the science will go. Although I think there's lots of opportunity for that research to be done, and it should be done. I think what's interesting when you're thinking about those questions like explainability with AI and stuff is like where you set the default as a matter of policy when you haven't done that research yet, or when the research is in flux and very uncertain. And I don't have an answer, although I suppose I lean towards deploying AI systems that are explainable whenever possible, unless there's a good reason not to. So I guess that would be my starting default. But anyway, defaults can influence the direction the research goes. And the other question about, yeah, it seems to me it's a good example that Andreas raised, where in terms of, if you think in terms of vulnerability to techno-social engineering, like the emotional. See, I think it's, Luciano, your response that like they're always aiming at the group and not at the individual for now is an important point. Of course, the quest for personalized everything, right? Personalized stimuli, in other words, whether the stimulus in the personalization of a stimuli to get a desired response, right, may vary. The inputs for the personalization may very well be emotional, data regarding your current emotional state, and that is concerning. That is something that, as a default, you think it triggers this concern about the vulnerability of the person and their ability to determine their own will and make their own decisions about what they're doing. But I think I'd need to sort of think more about whether a ban is the answer versus other regulatory responses. What I think is actually maybe a general point for this entire conversation is that, I'm a comparative institutionalist when it comes to lots of different problems. And as lawyers, those of you in the audience who are law students, you should become comparative institutionalists. And what that means is you compare different institutional solutions to the problems. And so, taxation versus bans versus direct command and control regulation versus, and we can go down a laundry list of different potential interventions, have different pros and cons, and they fit different kinds of problems better and worse. And so when you think about digital advertising, banning the thing that creates the demand for all the bad stuff, which is maybe the building and deployment of a surveillance infrastructure, when there's other sources of demand, might not be the best, or not, it's an incomplete, it may not even be the best approach, where, for example, as Luciano made the reference with regard to spam way back when, significantly raising the cost and just making it a lot more expensive via taxation to get the inputs you need to be able to do the dangerous kinds of targeted ads, might be a better and more effective approach.
Thank you very much for your responses. I have to admit, I've been recovering from concussion last 1 month, so it's been kind of difficult to last couple of minutes, and I can imagine also for you, Brett, and for Luciano as well, because it's been a long day, and this might be a lot, 2 hours speaking nonstop. Thank you so much for doing this, and
thank you.
I think this is one of the great and most central questions of the current era, and I think we having this kind of discussions is also expressing our democracy and trying to put the power within each individual and trying to create the world where all of us can have power over our lives. So thank you very much for your great contribution through today, but most importantly through your work. And I see thank yous in the chat. Of course, everybody is very happy.
Thank you, everybody.
Yep, thanks everybody. It was fun. Thanks for arranging, Lexo. That was great.
Yeah, indeed.
My pleasure, definitely my pleasure. And hopefully, really, but not just hopefully, but I'm counting on seeing you in the Netherlands at some point. But you have many connections in the Netherlands apparently. So, and I'm sure that Luciano also has a lot in common with the Netherlands. So hopefully we will see each other in the Netherlands, in the Leiden Law School. We will have you here where Einstein and Lawrence used to teach, and give you the floor.
That would be wonderful.
With pleasure. It's a promise.
Yes. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, everybody.
Yeah.
And for
Thanks,
the
everybody.
long patience exercise. Thank you. Cheers. Bye-bye.